Now turn to the hemisphere on the right, the women's side, and you also discover seas, more numerous indeed, but of smaller dimensions and with gentler names, as more befitting the feminine temperament. First comes Mare Serenitatis, the Sea of Serenity, so expressive of the calm, tranquil soul of an innocent maiden. Near it is Lacus Somnorum, the lake of dreams, in which she loves to gaze at her gilded and rosy future. In the southern division is seen Mare Nectaris, the Sea of Nectar, over whose soft, heaving billows she is gently wafted by love's caressing winds, youth on the prow and pleasure at the helm. Not far off is Mare Fecunditatis, the Sea of Fertility, in which she becomes the happy mother of rejoicing children. A little north is Mare Chrysium, the Sea of Crises, where her life and happiness are sometimes exposed to sudden and unexpected dangers which fortunately, however, seldom end fatally. Far to the left, near the men's side, is Mare Vaporum, the Sea of Vapors, into which, though it is rather small and full of sunken rocks, she sometimes allows herself to wander, moody and pouting, and not exactly knowing where she wants to go or what she wants to do. Between the two last expands the great Mare Tranquillitatis, the Sea of Tranquility, into whose quiet depths are at last absorbed all her simulated passions, all her futile aspirations, all her unglutted desires, and whose unruffled waters are gliding on forever in noiseless current towards Lacus Mortis, the lake of death, whose misty shores in ruthless, vast and gloomy woods are girt. So at least Arden mused as he stooped over Beer and Meidler's map. Did not these strange successive names somewhat justify his flights of fancy? Surely they had a wonderful variety of meaning. Was it by accident or by forethought deep that the two hemispheres of the moon had been thus so strangely divided, yet, as man to woman, though divided still united, and thus forming even in the cold regions of space, a perfect image of our terrestrial existence? Who can say that our romantic French friend was altogether wrong in thus explaining the astute fancies of the old astronomers? His companions, however, it need hardly be said, never saw the seas in that light. They looked on them not with sentimental but with geographical eyes. They studied this new world and tried to get it by heart, working at it like a schoolboy at his lessons. They began by measuring its angles and diameters. To their practical, common-sense vision, Mare Nubium, the cloudy sea, was an immense depression of the surface, sprinkled here and there with a few circular mountains, covering a great portion of that part of the southern hemisphere which lies east of the center. It occupied a space of about 270,000 square miles, its central point lying in 15 degrees south latitude and degrees east longitude. Northeast from this lay Oceanus Procellarum, the ocean of tempests, the most extensive of all the plains on the lunar disk, embracing a surface of about 500,000 of square miles, its center being in 10 degrees north and degrees east. From its bosom, those wonderful mountains Kepler and Aristarchus lifted their vast ramparts glittering with innumerable streaks radiating in all directions. To the north, in the direction of Mare Frigoris, extends Mare Imbrium, the Sea of Rains, its central point in 35 degrees north and degrees east. It is somewhat circular in shape, and it covers a space of about 300,000 square miles south of Oceanus Procellarum, and separated from Mare Nubium by a goodly number of ring mountains, lies the little basin of Mare Humorum, the Sea of Humours, containing only about 66,000 square miles, its central point having a latitude of 25 degrees south and a longitude of 40 degrees east. On the shores of these great seas 3 gulfs are easily found: Sinus Aestuum, the Gulf of the Tides, northeast of the centre; Sinus Iridium, the Gulf of the Rainbows, northeast of the Mare Imbrium; and Sinus Roris, the Dewy Gulf, a little further northeast. All seem to be small plains enclosed between chains of lofty mountains. The Western Hemisphere, dedicated to the ladies, according to Arden, and therefore naturally more capricious, was remarkable for seas of smaller dimensions, but much more numerous. These were principally Mare Serenitatis, the Sea of Serenity, 25 degrees north and degrees west, comprising a surface of about 130,000 square miles; Mare Chrysium, the Sea of Crises, a round, well-defined dark depression towards the northwestern edge, 17 degrees north, 55 degrees west, embracing a surface of 60,000 square miles, a regular Caspian Sea in fact, only that the plateau in which it lies buried is surrounded by a girdle of much higher mountains. Then towards the equator, with a latitude of 5 degrees north and a longitude of 25 degrees west, appears Mare Tranquillitatis, the Sea of Tranquility, occupying about 180,000 square miles. This communicates on the south with Mare Nectaris, the Sea of Nectar, embracing an extent of about 42,000 square miles, with a mean latitude of 15 degrees south and a longitude of 35 degrees west. Southwest from Mare Tranquillitatis lies Mare Fecunditatis, the Sea of Fertility, the greatest in this hemisphere, as it occupies an extent of more than 300,000 square miles, its latitude being 3 degrees south and its longitude 50 degrees west. For away to the north on the borders of the Mare Frigoris or Icy Sea is seen the small Mare Humboldtianum, or Humboldt Sea, with a surface of about 10,000 square miles. Corresponding to this in the southern hemisphere lies the Mare Austral, or South Sea, whose surface as it extends along the western rim is rather difficult to calculate. Finally, right in the center of the lunar disk, where the equator intersects the first meridian, can be seen Sinus Medii, the central gulf, the common property therefore of all the hemispheres, the northern and southern, as well as of the eastern and western. Into these great divisions, the surface of our satellite resolved itself before the eyes of Barbicane and 1,000 Nicholl. Adding up the various measurements, they found that the surface of her visible hemisphere was about 712 millions of square miles, of which about the 2/3 comprised the volcanoes, the mountain chains, the rings, the islands, in short, the land portion of the lunar surface. The other third comprised the seas, the lakes, the marshes, the bays or gulfs, and the other divisions usually assigned to water. To all this deeply interesting information, though the fruit of observation the closest, aided and confirmed by calculation the profoundest, Ardan listened with the utmost indifference. In fact, even his French politeness could not suppress 2 or 3 decided yawns, which of course the mathematicians were too absorbed to notice. In their enthusiasm they tried to make him understand that though the moon is 13.12 times smaller than our Earth, she can show more than 50,000 craters, which astronomers have already counted and designated by specific names. To conclude this portion of our investigation, therefore, cried Barbicane, clearing his throat and occupying Alden's right ear, the moon's surface is a honey-combed, perforated, punctured. A fistulous, a rugose, sailbrous, cut in the captain close on the left, and highly cribriform superficies, cried Barbicane. A sieve, a riddle, a colander, shouted the captain. A skimming dish, a buckwheat cake, a lump of green cheese, went on Barbicane. In fact, there is no knowing how far they would have proceeded with their designations, comparisons, and scientific expressions, had not Ardan, driven to extremities by Barbicane's last profanity, suddenly jumped up, broken away from his companions, and clapped a forcible extinguisher on their eloquence by putting his hands on their lips and keeping them there a while. Then, striking a grand attitude, he looked towards the moon and burst out in accents of thrilling indignation. "Pardon, O beautiful Diana of the Ephesians! Pardon, O Phoebe, thou pearl-faced goddess of night beloved of Greece! O Isis, thou sympathetic queen of Nile-washed cities! O Astarte, thou favourite deity of the Syrian hills! O Artemis, thou symbolical daughter of Jupiter and Latona, that is of light and darkness! O brilliant sister of the radiant Apollo, enshrined in the enchanting strains of Virgil and Homer, which I only half learned at college, and therefore unfortunately forget just now. Otherwise what pleasure I should have had in hurling them at the heads of Barbicane, 1,000 Nicholl, and every other barbarous iconoclast of the 19th century." Here he stopped short for 2 reasons. First, he was out of breath. Secondly, he saw that the irrepressible scientists had been too busy making observations of their own to hear a single word of what he had uttered, and were probably totally unconscious that he had spoken at all. In a few seconds his breath came back in full blast, but the idea of talking when only deaf men were listening was so disconcerting as to leave him actually unable to get off another syllable. Chapter 12. A bird's eye view of the lunar mountains. I am rather inclined to believe myself that not one word of Ardan's rhapsody had been ever heard by Barbicane or 1,000 Nicholl. Long before he had spoken his last words, they had once more become mute as statues, and now were both eagerly watching, pencil in hand, spyglass to eye, the northern lunar hemisphere towards which they were rapidly but indirectly approaching. They had fully made up their minds by this time that they were leaving far behind them the central point, which they would have probably reached half an hour ago if they had not been shunted off their course by that inopportune bolide. About 12:30 o'clock, Barbicane broke the dead silence by saying that after a careful calculation they were now only about 875 miles from the moon's surface, a distance 200 miles less in length than the lunar radius, and which was still to be diminished as they advanced further north. They were at that moment 10 degrees north of the equator, almost directly over the ridge lying between the Mare Serenitatis and the Mare Tranquillitatis. From this latitude all the way up to the North Pole, the travelers enjoyed a most satisfactory view of the moon in all directions, and under the most favorable conditions. By means of their spyglasses, magnifying 100 times, they cut down this distance of 875 miles to about 9. The great telescope of the Rocky Mountains, by its enormous magnifying power of 48,000, brought the moon, it is true, within a distance of 5 miles, or nearly twice as near. But this advantage of nearness was considerably more than counterbalanced by a want of clearness, resulting from the haziness and refractiveness of the terrestrial atmosphere, not to mention those fatal defects in the reflector that the art of man has not yet succeeded in remedying. Accordingly, our travellers, armed with excellent telescopes, of just power enough to be no injury to clearness, and posted on unequalled vantage ground, began already to distinguish certain details that had probably never been noticed before by terrestrial observers. Even Arden, by this time quite recovered from his fit of sentiment, and probably infected a little by the scientific enthusiasm of his companions, began to observe and note, alternately, with all the sang-froid of a veteran astronomer. "Friends," said Barbicane, again interrupting a silence that had lasted perhaps 10 minutes, "whither we are going I can't say. If we shall ever revisit the earth I can't tell. Still, it is our duty so to act in all respects as if these labours of ours were one day to be of service to our fellow creatures. Let us keep our souls free from every distraction. We are now astronomers. We see now what no mortal eye has ever gazed on before. This projectile is simply a workroom of the great Cambridge Observatory lifted into space. Let us take observations." With these words, he set to work with a renewed ardour, in which his companions fully participated. The consequence was that they soon had several of the outline maps covered with the best sketches they could make of the moon's various aspects thus presented under such favourable circumstances. They could now remark not only that they were passing the 10th degree of north latitude, but that the projectile followed almost directly the 20th degree of east longitude. "One thing always puzzled me when examining maps of the moon," observed Arden, "and I can't say that I see it yet as clearly as if I had thought over the matter. It is this. I could understand, when looking through a lens at an object, why we get only its reversed image. A simple law of optics explains that. Therefore, in a map of the moon, as the bottom means the north and the top the south, why does not the right mean the west and the left the east? I suppose I could have made this out by a little thought, but thinking, that is reflection, not being my forte, it is the last thing I ever care to do. Barbicane, throw me a word or two on the subject." "I can see what troubles you," answered Barbicane, "but I can also see that one moment's reflection would have put an end to your perplexity. On ordinary maps of the Earth's surface, when the north is the top, the right hand must be the east, the left hand the west, and so on. That is simply because we look down from above, and such a map seen through a lens will appear reversed in all respects. But in looking at the moon, that is up from down, we change our position so far that our right hand points west and our left east. Consequently, in our reversed map, though the north becomes south, the right remains east and—" "Enough said, I see it at a glance. Thank you, Barbicane. Why did not they make you a professor of astronomy? Your hint will save me a world of trouble." Aided by the Mappa Selenographica, the travellers could easily recognize the different portions of the moon over which they were now moving. An occasional glance at our reduction of this map, given as a frontispiece, will enable the gentle reader to follow the travellers on the line in which they moved, and to understand the remarks and observations in which they occasionally indulged. "Where are we now?" asked Arden. "Over the northern shores of the Mare Nubium," replied Barbicane, "but we are still too far off to see with any certainty what they are like. What is the mare itself? A sea, according to the early astronomers, a plain of solid sand, according to later authority, or an immense forest, according to de la Rue of London, so far the moon's most successful photographer. This gentleman's authority, Arden, would have given you decided support in your famous dispute with the captain at the meeting near Tampa, for he says very decidedly that the moon has an atmosphere, very low to be sure, but very dense. This, however, we must find out for ourselves, and in the meantime let us affirm nothing until we have good grounds for positive assertion. Mare Nubium, though not very clearly outlined on the maps, is easily recognized by lying directly east of the regions about the center. It would appear as if this vast plain was sprinkled with immense lava blocks shot forth from the great volcanoes on the right, Tolmius, Alphonse, Alpetragius and Arzachel, but the projectile advanced so rapidly that these mountains soon disappeared, and the travellers were not long before they could distinguish the great peaks that closed the sea on its northern boundary. Here a radiating mountain showed a summit so dazzling, with the reflection of the solar rays, that Arden could not help crying out. "It looks like one of the carbon points of an electric light projected on a screen. What do you call it, Barbicane?" "Copernicus," replied the president. "Let us examine old Copernicus." This grand crater is deservedly considered one of the greatest of the lunar wonders. It lifts its giant ramparts to upwards of 12,000 feet above the level of the lunar surface. Being quite visible from the Earth and well situated for observation, it is a favorite object for astronomical study. This is particularly the case during the phase existing between last quarter and the new moon, when its vast shadows, projected boldly from the east towards the west, allow its prodigious dimensions to be measured. After Tycho, which is situated in the southern hemisphere, Copernicus forms the most important radiating mountain in the lunar disk. It looms up, single and isolated, like a gigantic lighthouse, on the peninsula separating Mare Nubium from Oceanus Procellarum on one side, and from Mare Imbrium on the other, thus illuminating with its splendid radiation 3 seas at a time. The wonderful complexity of its bright streaks diverging on all sides from its center presented a scene alike splendid and unique. These streaks, the travelers thought, could be traced further north than in any other direction. They fancied they could detect them even in the Mare Imbrium, but this of course might be owing to the point from which they made their observations. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the projectile, flying through space, was exactly over this magnificent mountain. In spite of the brilliant sunlight that was blazing around them, the travelers could easily recognize the peculiar features of Copernicus. It belongs to those ring mountains of the first class called circuses. Like Kepler and Aristarchus, who rule over Oceanus Procellarum, Copernicus, when viewed through our telescopes, sometimes glistens so brightly through the ashy light of the moon that it has been frequently taken for a volcano in full activity. Whatever it may have been once, however, it is certainly nothing more now than, like all the other mountains on the visible side of the moon, an extinct volcano, only with a crater of such exceeding grandeur and sublimity as to throw utterly into the shade everything like it on our Earth. The crater of Etna is at most little more than a mile across. The crater of Copernicus has a diameter of at least 50 miles. Within it, the travelers could easily discover by their glasses an immense number of terraced ridges, probably landslips, alternating with stratifications resulting from successive eruptions. Here and there, but particularly in the southern side, they caught glimpses of shadows of such intense blackness, projected across the plateau and lying there like pitch spots, that they could not tell them from yawning chasms of incalculable depth. Outside the crater the shadows were almost as deep, whilst on the plains all around, particularly in the west, so many small craters could be detected that the eye in vain attempted to count them. Many circular mountains of this kind, observed Barbicane, can be seen on the lunar surface, but Copernicus, though not one of the greatest, is one of the most remarkable on account of those diverging streaks of bright light that you see radiating from its summit. By looking steadily into its crater, you can see more cones than mortal eye ever lit on before. They are so numerous as to render the interior plateau quite rugged, and were formerly so many openings giving vent to fire and volcanic matter. A curious and very common arrangement of this internal plateau of lunar craters is its lying at a lower level than the external plains, quite the contrary to a terrestrial crater, which generally has its bottom much higher than the level of the surrounding country. It follows therefore that the deep-lying curve of the bottom of these ring mountains would give a sphere with a diameter somewhat smaller than the moon's. "What can be the cause of this peculiarity?" asked 1000 Nicholl. "I can't tell," answered Barbicane, "but, as a conjecture, I should say that it is probably to the comparatively smaller area of the moon, and the more violent character of her volcanic action that the extremely rugged character of her surface is mainly due." "Why, it's the Campi Flegrei or the fire fields of Naples over again," cried Arden suddenly. "There's Monte Barbaro, there's the Solfatara, there is the crater of Astrone, and there is the Monte Nuovo, as plain as the hand on my body. The great resemblance between the region you speak of and the general surface of the moon has been often remarked," observed Barbicane, "but it is even still more striking in the neighbourhood of Theophilus on the borders of Mare Nectaris." "That's Mare Nectaris, the grey spot over there on the southwest, isn't it?" asked 1000 Nicholl. "Is there any likelihood of our getting a better view of it?" "Not the slightest," answered Barbicane, "unless we go round the moon and return this way, like a satellite describing its orbit." By this time they had arrived at a point vertical to the mountain center. Copernicus's vast ramparts formed a perfect circle, or rather a pair of concentric circles. All around the mountain extended a dark greyish plain of savage aspect, on which the peak shadows projected themselves in sharp relief. In the gloomy bottom of the crater, whose dimensions are vast enough to swallow Mont Blanc body and bones, could be distinguished a magnificent group of cones, at least half a mile in height and glittering like piles of crystal. Towards the north several breaches could be seen in the ramparts, due probably to a caving in of immense masses accumulated on the summit of the precipitous walls. As already observed, the surrounding plains were dotted with numberless craters mostly of small dimensions, except Gay-Lussac on the north, whose crater was about 12 miles in diameter. Towards the southwest and the immediate east, the plain appeared to be very flat, no protuberance, no prominence of any kind lifting itself above the general dead level. Towards the north, on the contrary, as far as where the peninsula jutted on Oceanus Procellarum, the plain looked like a sea of lava wildly lashed for a while by a furious hurricane, and then, when its waves and breakers and driving ridges were at their wildest, suddenly frozen into solidity. Over this rugged, rumpled, wrinkled surface and in all directions, ran the wonderful streaks whose radiating point appeared to be the summit of Copernicus. Many of them appeared to be 10 miles wide and hundreds of miles in length. The travellers disputed for some time on the origin of these strange radii, but could hardly be said to have arrived at any conclusion more satisfactory than that already reached by some terrestrial observers. To 1000 Nicholl's question, why can't these streaks be simply prolonged mountain crests, reflecting the sun's rays more vividly by their superior altitude and comparative smoothness? Barbicane readily replied, these streaks can't be mountain crests because if they were, under certain conditions of solar illumination, they should project shadows, a thing which they have never been known to do under any circumstances whatever. In fact, it is only during the period of the full moon that these streaks are seen at all. As soon as the sun's rays become oblique, they disappear altogether, a proof that their appearance is due altogether to peculiar advantages in their surface for the reflection of light. Dear boys, will you allow me to give my little guess on the subject? Asked Arden. His companions were profuse in expressing their desire to hear it. Well then, he resumed, seeing that these bright streaks invariably start from a certain point to radiate in all directions, why not suppose them to be streams of lava issuing from the crater and flowing down the mountain side until they cooled? Such a supposition or something like it has been put forth by Herschel, replied Barbicane, but your own sense will convince you that it is quite untenable when you consider that lava, however hot and liquid it may be at the commencement of its journey, cannot flow on for hundreds of miles, up hills, across ravines, and over plains, all the time in streams of almost exactly equal width. That theory of yours holds no more water than mine, Arden, observed 1000 Nicholl. Correct, Captain, replied the Frenchman. Barbicane has a trick of knocking the bottom out of every weaker vessel, but let us hear what he has to say on the subject himself. What is your theory, Barbicane? My theory, said Barbicane, is pretty much the same as that lately presented by an English astronomer, Nasmyth, who has devoted much study and reflection to lunar matters. Of course, I only formulate my theory, I don't affirm it. These streaks are cracks, made in the moon's surface by cooling or by shrinkage, through which volcanic matter has been forced up by internal pressure. The sinking ice of a frozen lake, when meeting with some sharp-pointed rock, cracks in a radiating manner. Every one of its fissures then admits the water, which immediately spreads laterally over the ice pretty much as the lava spreads itself over the lunar surface. This theory accounts for the radiating nature of the streaks, their great and nearly equal thickness, their immense length, their inability to cast a shadow, and their invisibility at any time except at or near the full moon. Still, it is nothing but a theory, and I don't deny that serious objections may be brought against it. Do you know, dear boys, cried Arden, led off as usual by the slightest fancy, do you know what I am thinking of when I look down on the great rugged plains spread out beneath us? I can't say, I'm sure, replied Barbicane, somewhat piqued at the little attention he had secured for his theory. Well, what are you thinking of? Asked 1000 Nicholl. Spillikins, answered Arden triumphantly. Spillikins, cried his companions, somewhat surprised. Yes, spillikins, these rocks, these blocks, these peaks, these streaks, these cones, these cracks, these ramparts, these escarpments, what are they but a set of spillikins, though I acknowledge on a grand scale, I wish I had a little hook to pull them one by one. An immense battlefield. An immense battlefield. Oh, do be serious, Arden, cried Barbican a little impatiently. Certainly, replied Arden. Let us be serious, Captain, since seriousness best befits the subject in hand. What do you think of another comparison? Does not this plain look like an immense battlefield, piled with the bleaching bones of myriads who had slaughtered each other to a man at the bidding of some mighty Caesar? What do you think of that lofty comparison, hey? It is quite on a par with the other, muttered Barbican. He's hard to please, Captain, continued Arden, but let us try him again. Does not this plain look like— My worthy friend, interrupted Barbican quietly, but in a tone to discourage further discussion, what you think the plain looks like is of very slight import, as long as you know no more than a child what it really is. Bravo, Barbican, well put, cried the irrepressible Frenchman. Shall I ever realize the absurdity of my entering into an argument with a scientist? But this time the projectile, though advancing northward with a pretty uniform velocity, had neither gained nor lost in its nearness to the lunar disk. Each moment altering the character of the fleeting landscape beneath them, the travellers, as may well be imagined, never thought of taking an instant's repose. At about 1:30, looking to their right on the west, they saw the summits of another mountain. Barbican, consulting his map, recognized Eratosthenes. This was a ring mountain about 33 miles in diameter, having, like Copernicus, a crater of immense profundity containing central cones. Whilst they were directing their glasses towards its gloomy depths, Barbican mentioned to his friends Kepler's strange idea regarding the formation of these ring mountains. They must have been constructed, he said, by mortal hands. With what object? Asked the captain. A very natural one, answered Barbican. The Selenites must have undertaken the immense labour of digging these enormous pits at places of refuge, in which they could protect themselves against the fierce solar rays that beat against them for 15 days in succession. Not a bad idea, that of the Selenites, exclaimed Arden. An absurd idea, cried 1000 Nicholl, but probably Kepler never knew the real dimensions of these craters. Barbican knows the trouble and time required to dig a well in Stony Hill only 900 feet deep. To dig out a single lunar crater would take hundreds and hundreds of years, and even then they should be giants who would attempt it. Why so? Asked Arden. In the moon, where gravity is 6 times less than on the Earth, the labour of the Selenites can't be compared with that of men like us. But suppose a Selenite to be 6 times smaller than a man like us, urged 1000 Nicholl. And suppose a Selenite never had an existence at all, interposed Barbican with his usual success in putting an end to the argument. But never mind the Selenites now. Observe Eratosthenes as long as you have the opportunity. Which will not be very long, said 1000 Nicholl. He is already sinking out of view too far to the right to be carefully observed. What are those peaks beyond him? Asked Arden. The Apennines, answered Barbican, and those on the left are the Carpathians. I have seen very few mountain chains or ranges in the moon, remarked Arden after some minutes' observation. Mountains' chains are not numerous in the moon, replied Barbican, and in that respect her orographic system presents a decided contrast with that of the Earth. With us the ranges are many, the craters few. In the moon the ranges are few and the craters innumerable. Barbican might have spoken of another curious feature regarding the mountain ranges, namely that they are chiefly confined to the northern hemisphere, where the craters are fewest and the seas the most extensive. For the benefit of those interested, and to be done at once with this part of the subject, we give in the following little table a list of the chief lunar mountain chains, with their latitude and respective heights in English feet. Name degrees of latitude height. Southern Hemisphere. Brace. Altai Mountains. Cordilleras. Pyrenees. Riffian 17 degrees to 28. 10 to 20. 8 to 18. 5 to 10 13,000 ft. 12,000. 12,000. 2,600. Northern Hemisphere. Brace. Hemus. Carpathian. Apennines. Taurus. Hercynian, Caucasus, Alps 10 to 20, 15 to 19, 14 to 27, 25 to 34, 17 to 29, 33 to 40, 42 to 36,300, 6,000, 18,000, 8,500, 3,400, 17,000, 10,000. Of these different chains, the most important is that of the Apennines, about 450 miles long, a length, however, far inferior to that of many of the great mountain ranges of our globe. They skirt the western shores of the Mare Imbrium, over which they rise in immense cliffs, 18 or 20,000 feet in height, steep as a wall and casting over the plain intensely black shadows at least 90 miles long. Of Mt. Hykins, the highest in the group, the travellers were just barely able to distinguish the sharp, angular summit in the far west. To the east, however, the Carpathians, extending from the 18th to 30th degrees of east longitude, lay directly under their eyes and could be examined in all the peculiarities of their distribution. Barbicane proposed a hypothesis regarding the formation of those mountains, which his companions thought at least as good as any other. Looking carefully over the Carpathians, and catching occasional glimpses of semicircular formations and half-domes, he concluded that the chain must have formerly been a succession of vast craters, then had come some mighty internal discharge, or rather the subsidence to which Mare Imbrium is due, for it immediately broke off or swallowed up one half of those mountains, leaving the other half steep as a wall on one side, and sloping gently on the other to the level of the surrounding plains. The Carpathians were therefore pretty nearly in the same condition as the crater mountains Ptolemy, Alpetragius and Arzachel would find themselves in, if some terrible cataclysm, by tearing away their eastern ramparts, had turned them into a chain of mountains whose towering cliffs would nod threateningly over the western shores of Mare Nubium. The mean height of the Carpathians is about 6,000 feet, the altitude of certain points in the Pyrenees, such as the Port of Pindar, or Roland's Breach, in the shadow of Mont Perdu. The northern slopes of the Carpathians sink rapidly towards the shores of the vast Mare Imbrium. Towards 2 o'clock in the morning, Barbicane calculated the projectile to be on the 20th northern parallel, and therefore almost immediately over the little ring mountain called Pythias, about 4,600 feet in height. The distance of the travellers from the moon at this point could not be more than about 750 miles, reduced to about 7 by means of their excellent telescopes. Mare Imbrium, the Sea of Rains, here revealed itself in all its vastness to the eyes of the travellers, though it must be acknowledged that the immense depression so called did not afford them a very clear idea regarding its exact boundaries. Right ahead of them rose Lambert about a mile in height, and further on, more to the left, in the direction of Oceanus Procelarum, Euler revealed itself by its glittering radiations. This mountain, of about the same height as Lambert, had been the object of very interesting calculations on the part of Schroeter of Erfurt. This keen observer, desirous of inquiring into the probable origin of the lunar mountains, had proposed to himself the following question: does the volume of the crater appear to be equal to that of the surrounding ramparts? His calculations showing him that this was generally the case, he naturally concluded that these ramparts must therefore have been the product of a single eruption, for successive eruptions of volcanic matter would have disturbed this correlation. Euler alone he found to be an exception to this general law, as the volume of its crater appeared to be twice as great as that of the mass surrounding it. It must therefore have been formed by several eruptions in succession, but in that case, what had become of the ejected matter? Theories of this nature and all manner of scientific questions were, of course, perfectly permissible to terrestrial astronomers labouring under the disadvantage of imperfect instruments, but Barbicane could not think of wasting his time in any speculation of the kind, and now, seeing that his projectile perceptibly approached the lunar disk, though he despaired of ever reaching it, he was more sanguine than ever of being soon able to discover positively and unquestionably some of the secrets of its formation. Chapter 13. Lunar Landscapes. At 2:30 in the morning of December 6th, the travellers crossed the 30th northern parallel, at a distance from the lunar surface of 625 miles, reduced to about 6 by their spy-glasses. Barbicane could not yet see the least probability of their landing at any point of the disk. The velocity of the projectile was decidedly slow, but for that reason extremely puzzling. Barbicane could not account for it. At such a proximity to the moon, the velocity, one would think, should be very great indeed to be able to counteract the lunar attraction. Why did it not fall? Barbicane could not tell. His companions were equally in the dark. Arden said he gave it up. Besides, they had no time to spend in investigating it. The lunar panorama was unrolling all its splendors beneath them, and they could not bear to lose one of its slightest details. The lunar disk being brought within a distance of about 6 miles by the spyglasses, it is a fair question to ask, what could an aeronaut at such an elevation from our Earth discover on its surface? At present that question can hardly be answered, the most remarkable balloon ascensions never having passed an altitude of 5 miles under circumstances favorable for observers. Here, however, is an account, carefully transcribed from notes taken on the spot, of what Barbicane and his companions did see from their peculiar post of observation. Varieties of color, in the first place, appeared here and there upon the disk. Selenographers are not quite agreed as to the nature of these colors, not that such colors are without variety or too faint to be easily distinguished. Schmidt of Athens even says that if our oceans on Earth were all evaporated, an observer in the moon would hardly find the seas and continents of our globe even so well outlined as those of the moon are to the eye of a terrestrial observer. According to him, the shade of color distinguishing those vast plains known as seas is a dark gray dashed with green and brown, a color presented also by a few of the great craters. This opinion of Schmidt's, shared by Beer and Meidler, Barbicane's observations now convinced him to be far better founded than that of certain astronomers, who admit of no color at all being visible on the moon's surface but gray. In certain spots the greenish tint was quite decided, particularly in Mare Serenitatis and Mare Humorum, the very localities where Schmidt had most noticed it. Barbicane also remarked that several large craters of the class that had no interior cones reflected a kind of bluish tinge, somewhat like that given forth by a freshly polished steel plate. These tints, he now saw enough to convince him, proceeded really from the lunar surface, and were not due, as certain astronomers asserted, either to the imperfections of the spyglasses or to the interference of the terrestrial atmosphere. His singular opportunity for correct observation allowed him to entertain no doubt whatever on the subject. Hampered by no atmosphere, he was free from all liability to optical illusion. Satisfied, therefore, as to the reality of these tints, he considered such knowledge a positive gain to science. But that greenish tint, to what was it due? To a dense tropical vegetation maintained by a low atmosphere, a mile or so in thickness, possibly. But this was another question that could not be answered at present. Further on he could detect here and there traces of a decidedly ruddy tint. Such a shade he knew had been already detected in the Palus Somnii, near Mare Crisium, and in the circular area of Lichtenberg, near the Hercynian Mountains, on the eastern edge of the moon. To what cause was this tint to be attributed? To the actual color of the surface itself, or to that of the lava covering it here and there, or to the color resulting from the mixture of other colors seen at a distance too great to allow of their being distinguished separately? Impossible to tell. Barbicane and his companions succeeded no better at a new problem that soon engaged their undivided attention. It deserves some detail. Having passed Lambert, being just over Timicoris, all were attentively gazing at the magnificent crater of Archimedes with a diameter of 52 miles across, and ramparts more than 5,000 feet in height, when Arden startled his companions by suddenly exclaiming, "Hello, cultivated fields, as I am a living man." "What do you mean by your cultivated fields?" asked 1000 Nicholl sourly, wiping his glasses and shrugging his shoulders. "Certainly cultivated fields," replied Arden. "Don't you see the furrows? They're certainly plain enough. They are white too from glistening in the sun, but they are quite different from the radiating streaks of Copernicus. Why, their sides are perfectly parallel." "Where are those furrows?" asked 1000 Nicholl, putting his glasses to his eye and adjusting the focus. "You can see them in all directions," answered Arden, "but two are particularly visible, one running north from Archimedes, the other south towards the Apennines." 1000 Nicholl's face, as he gazed, gradually assumed a grin which soon developed into a snicker, if not a positive laugh, as he observed to Arden, "Your Selenites must be Brobdingnagians, their oxen leviathans, and their plows bigger than Marston's famous cannon, if these are furrows." "How's that, Barbicane?" asked Arden doubtfully, but unwilling to submit to 1000 Nicholl. "They're not furrows, dear friend," said Barbicane, "and can't be either simply on account of their immense size. They are what the German astronomers called Rillen, the French rainures, and the English grooves, canals, clefts, cracks, chasms, or fissures. You have a good stock of names for them anyhow, observed Arden, if that does any good. The number of names given them, answered Barbicane, shows how little is really known about them. They have been observed in all the level portion of the moon's surface. Small as they appear to us, a little calculation must convince you that they are in some places hundreds of miles in length, a mile in width, and probably in many points several miles in depth. Their width and depth, however, vary, though their sides, so far as observed, are always rigorously parallel. Let us take a good look at them. Putting the glass to his eye, Barbicane examined the clefts for some time with close attention. He saw that their banks were sharp-edged and extremely steep. In many places they were of such geometrical regularity that he readily excused Gruithuysen's idea of deeming them to be gigantic earthworks thrown up by the Selenite engineers. Some of them were as straight as if laid out with a line, others were curved a little here and there, though still maintaining the strict parallelism of their sides. These crossed each other, those entered craters and came out at the other side. Here they furrowed annular plateaus, such as Posidonius or Petavius. There they wrinkled whole seas, for instance, Mare Serenitatis. These curious peculiarities of the lunar surface had interested the astronomic mind to a very high degree at their first discovery, and have proved to be very perplexing problems ever since. The first observers do not seem to have noticed them. Neither Hevelius, nor Cassini, nor La Hire, nor Herschel makes a single remark regarding their nature. It was Schroeter in 1789 who called the attention of scientists to them for the first time. He had only 11 to show, but Loemann soon recorded more. Pastorff, Gruithuysen, and particularly Beer and Meidler were still more successful, but Julius Schmidt, the famous astronomer of Athens, has raised their number up to 425, and has even published their names in a catalogue. But counting them is one thing, determining their nature is another. They are not fortifications, certainly, and cannot be ancient beds of dried-up rivers for two very good and sufficient reasons. First, water, even under the most favourable circumstances on the moon's surface, could have never ploughed up such vast channels. Secondly, these chasms often traverse lofty craters through and through, like an immense railroad cutting. At these details, Arden's imagination became unusually excited, and of course it was not without some result. It even happened that he hit on an idea that had already suggested itself to Schmidt of Athens. Why not consider them, he asked, to be the simple phenomena of vegetation? What do you mean? Asked Barbicane. Rows of sugar cane, suggested 1000 Nicholl with a snicker. Not exactly, my worthy captain, answered Arden quietly, though you were perhaps nearer to the mark than you expected. I don't mean exactly rows of sugar cane, but I do mean vast avenues of trees, poplars, for instance, planted regularly on each side of a great high road. Still harping on vegetation, said the captain. Arden, what a splendid historian was spoiled in you. The less you know about your facts, the readier you are to account for them. Ma foi, said Arden simply, I do only what the greatest of your scientific men do, that is, guess. There is this difference, however, between us. I call my guesses mere conjecture. They dignify theirs as profound theories or as astounding discoveries. Often the case, friend Arden, too often the case, said Barbicane,